Hey everyone, welcome to Knowing Nuclear. In this episode, we are going to be talking about our energy choices. The world's use of primary energy, the energy we get from nature, is growing with time and with population. It's actually growing faster than population. If we look back at the 1800s, what we see is that our energy use started growing and that the Industrial Revolution brought about significant changes. We can broadly break our primary energy into two types: flows and fuels. So, our flows is the energy that is moving through nature that we can potentially harness. For example, we have wave power in the upper right hand corner. Those red Pelamis wave energy converters are bigger than you think they are. If you look at the bottom right corner, there's a boat there for scale. So, those long generators are actually moving up and down with the waves. The flow of energy in the waves bends the generators back and forth, and this movement generates electricity. Likewise, we have solar thermal energy, which is the upper left photo. Then we have wind in the middle and geothermal beside it on the right. And of course, we have hydropower, which is on the bottom left there. And then we have power that is coming from ocean currents as well as tidal power. So these energy sources are flowing through nature, and the difficulty is we can't actually deploy them when we want to, with the exception of hydropower. They're either on or off. We don't really have a whole lot of choice about that. Fuels, on the other hand, are dense sources of energy that are consumed when used. So natural gas, oil, and coal, which are all fossil fuels, are dense sources of energy. However, they release carbon dioxide that winds up changing the climate in dangerous ways. More on that later. And of course, those flows that we were just looking at, those don't release CO2. Biofuels do release CO2, but they also capture CO2. So the net amount of CO2 is a tricky thing, but for the most part, we can just say that biofuels don't really increase the climate change problem. And then we have nuclear energy. The photo on the bottom right there is uranium ore. Nuclear also doesn't release CO2 when it's consumed. So we have a number of limited energy options. And to be clear, the vast majority of the energy that we use is coming from fossil fuels, which is shown as gray on this chart. Biofuel use has increased, but not nearly as much as our overall energy use. All of the solar, wind, and hydro energy is shown as that red line across the top. While they're growing quickly, it's not really doing a whole lot to eat into that huge amount of fossil fuels that we're using. Nuclear has been staying consistent more or less. Nuclear has the ability to grow, as do solar and wind, but the difference is that nuclear has a huge untapped ability to grow that could actually replace some of those fossil fuel uses that we really need to reduce. Now, when we're talking about energy choices, people like to ask, well, what about batteries? What about electricity? Well, when you get a battery, something needs to put the energy into that battery. Something needs to put the energy into your wall socket for you to get electricity out. So when we're talking about electricity, electricity is always coming from some primary energy source that we're starting with. And we do need batteries for intermittent things like wind and solar. Remember, wind only works when the wind is blowing, and solar only works when the sun is shining, which is often. But we need to use electricity within a fraction of a second of when it's created. So we don't have a whole lot of batteries. In fact, all of the batteries in the world would give us at most minutes of electricity. So we need to be really, really cautious when we put huge amounts of wind and solar on the grid without something to back it up. Hydro does a good job of backing it up. And new generations of nuclear reactors are also doing a good job of being able to mesh more closely with wind and solar in order to create some real change in that huge gray wedge of fossil fuels that we really need to reduce. When discussing energy choices, some people will also talk about hydrogen in fuel cells. So you might have heard about standalone hydrogen fuel cell buses, or even Boeing's fuel cell airplane. A really important fact to note is that hydrogen, just like electricity, always relies on some primary source of energy. Hydrogen fuel does not naturally occur on Earth, which means we have to make it. So if we're going to make hydrogen, are we going to make gray hydrogen, blue hydrogen, or green hydrogen? Gray hydrogen is created using natural gas. Blue hydrogen is created in the same way, but with carbon capture and storage. And green hydrogen is created using fresh water and clean energy from a source that doesn't emit CO2. Nuclear doesn't emit CO2, so it can be an excellent source of hydrogen power. Next generation nuclear power plants are actually working hard to come up with ways of making hydrogen because we think that could have a big impact on the transportation sector. At the moment, nuclear is really good at generating electricity. It's building into other areas, and hydrogen is a growth area for nuclear right now. The key takeaway of this Knowing Nuclear video is that we have very few choices for sources of energy. Things like electricity and hydrogen require some primary energy source. We've been talking a lot about wind and solar, geothermal, hydro, wave, tidal power, and all of those sources are certainly part of our future. But we're having difficulty actually overcoming the fossil fuels with just those sources. Fossil fuels like oil, coal, and natural gas are consistently being used and are emitting a huge amount of CO2. So we want to avoid that by employing more renewables, biomass, and of course nuclear. Nuclear has a huge opportunity to grow into something bigger and make a huge impact on climate change.